It was one of the most consequential decisions in American history.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
And entirely based on a lie. The Iraq War was a pivotal moment in the history of the United States in the 21st century, and one almost entirely based on evidence that turned out to either be exaggerated or completely fraudulent. But how did the government get away with lying to the public like that? Why didn't the media, the Fourth Estate, do its job and keep people accountable? That's what we're going to explore today. What the government learned from their experiences in the Vietnam War and the development of the 24-hour news network. We're going to look at how the media atmosphere looked in 2003 and the factors that kept the political economy of the news industry running, and why it seemed perfectly designed to keep the state from ever dealing with any sort of accountability. And hopefully we'll come to some sort of understanding what the ethical obligations of journalists are, and why in 2003 they fell so short of what they're supposed to do. Because journalists are an essential part of a functioning democracy, and without them keeping the government to account, who knows what will happen. But to start, we get to talk about something that I actually took in grad school, so sit down, you're about to get way too much detail as we talk about the development of cable television. Trust me though, just trust me on this one. So the default for a very long time was broadcast television, rabbit ears on the top of your TV sets, that kind of thing. But that only worked if you had a station that was close enough to you that you could receive that signal. There were a lot of rural communities that had trouble getting those. Either they were too far away from a local station to broadcast to, or they lived in a mountainous region where having the line of sight necessary to get the TV signal was just unfeasible. So it was in these parts where cable got its start in the 1950s. More or less what they would do is have large antennae that could pick up the signals from further away that were far too big for any individual to afford, and through a network of cables send the television signal to all the different homes in the region. But things would change in the 1980s, where through some regulatory changes, there was a massive adoption of cable television, and importantly, cable TV networks that made content exclusively for cable subscribers. Because of the smaller reach of cable, the stations were a lot more local, and that meant that they could have more up-to-date information, which meant that a lot of these local stations had news bureaus of their own in which they could give you more up-to-date, very local news about what's going on in the region. Things then started to really pick up with the development of satellite communication, in which you could beam signals from space down to satellite dishes on the planet. Now, that is a huge thing for all sorts of different communications technology, but for television, that meant that you could have a station that sent its signals to these dishes that would then go out into the cable networks. Now, cable is interesting because compared to, say, broadcast television, you can have a lot more channels in one wire, which means that instead of having, the 3 or 4 television networks of your broadcast days, you could have lots of different channels, and because of satellite and sort of, your signal coming from space, that meant that you could broadcast to a larger audience. If you think about it, those two technologies together means that you would get more and more specialized types of TV channels. And this could easily be used for broadcasting things like movies or special sporting events. By the end of the 80s, this was so popular that there were more houses with cable television than there were broadcast, and many of them had over 30 channels. I know in our modern age that sounds rather quaint, but it was a pretty big deal for its time. This would explode even more in the 1990s when cable subscription services started to develop tiers, so for a higher premium, you could afford even more packets of even more channels. This is the reason you can have something like HBO or the Cartoon Network. You couldn't really make a profitable Cartoon Network if you were only broadcasting to your local area. You really need a national market and satellite content delivery in order to make that even function. With there being an opening for more national channels, a guy by the name of Ted Turner, who ran a news station in Georgia, began to take an interest in making a national market news network that just talked about the news all the time. Turner called this channel cable news network, or CNN, which began broadcast in June of 1980.
Good evening, I'm David Walker.
And I'm Lois Hart. Now here's the news.
Now, this would spell massive changes for the state of the way that we consume news. Before CNN, the ways that you got news were either through the newspaper, which would only arrive once, maybe twice a day, or the news broadcast. You'd probably hear this like the news at 6 or something like that. So it would be a once a day thing that you got that was curated. Now with CNN, you had instantaneous, relentless information coming on a 24-hour network. So by the time of the Iraq War, there were 3 major cable networks, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, that dominated America's attention, especially with a lot of boost from the 9/11 attack. So that's how we got to cable news as we understand it in 2003. There were 3 major networks at the time, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, and they were broadcasting instantaneous, relentless news all the time. And we would see that it would become very important when it came to the way that the media talked about America's wars, which is key because in the wake of the Vietnam War, the United States was trying to completely reimagine its relationship with the press in regards to the next war they wanted to conduct, because it's a state, and that means that there's always a next war they wish to conduct. The Vietnam War was pivotal for understanding the relationship between the U.S. government and the media when it comes to covering wars. For the U.S. government, the media coverage of Vietnam was an unmitigated disaster, let's be honest. The way that it worked is that the government really paid little mind to journalists on the ground at the time, and journalists, while they were in a more dangerous situation, were able to pursue stories wherever they found them. In a war situation in which a government is committing multiple war crimes and doing violence, and on top of that, the maimed and graphically dead bodies of American troops being sent back home for burial would all just wind up on the front pages of newspapers and on people's nightly television broadcasts. Early on in the war, journalists just listened to public information that came out from the military, but when they found that that was very lacking, they began to look for other sources and send their own journalists into the field to do their own research, and what they found was the nightmare I just described. This meant that by the mid-60s, the story that the US government was trying to sell, that the war was just about to be won if we could just commit a few more troops and a few more bombs and a few more guns, we could just do it, was obviously false. The story that was coming back to people's newspapers and television broadcasts every night was one of a war America was losing, and losing badly. This visceral, graphic, and honest reporting of a war on the ground was something American houses had never seen before or really since, and it instantly led to a huge decline in support for the war. By the end of the 60s, there was a massive anti-war movement, and support for continuing aggression in Vietnam was almost gone. There was a lot of pressure to end the war by any means necessary. It was bad enough for the government that the sitting president decided to not seek re-election. Now, this might sound foreign to viewers today, but this led to Americans being really against the concept of going into another war. This phenomenon was labeled by Norman Podhoretz in an article in Commentary magazine as Vietnam Syndrome.
Do we lack power? Certainly not, if power is measured in brute terms of economic, technological, and military capacity. By those standards, we are still the most powerful country in the world. The issue boils down, in the end, then, to the question of will.
The conservative narrative about why America lost the Vietnam War started to build around Vietnam Syndrome. They had the means to win, but not the will. And if America was going to get into the next war and the next war and be victorious, they had to find a way to stop Vietnam Syndrome. You know, instead of taking that as a lesson that when Americans see what war actually looks like, they tend not to like it, but this is the conservatives we're talking about. The first way to attempt to overcome Vietnam Syndrome happened in 1983 when the Reagan administration did essentially a illegal and completely unannounced invasion of the country of Grenada. When asked why he did so secretly without consulting Congress or the Pentagon or really anybody, he pointed that Vietnam Syndrome would have stopped him from doing what he felt needed to be done.
Frankie, there was another reason I wanted secrecy. Reagan later confided in his autobiography, "This is what I call the post-Vietnam syndrome. The resistance of so many in Congress to use the military force abroad for any reason because of our nation's experience in Vietnam. I suspect you that if we told the leaders of Congress about the appropriation, even under the terms of the strictest confidentiality, there would be someone who would leak it to the press together with the predictions that Grenada was going to become another Vietnam. We didn't ask anybody. We just did it."
What Reagan hoped is that a quick success in Grenada would change the narrative and the Vietnam syndrome idea would go away and people would understand that Americans actually do want another war. And the way to do that properly was to make sure that journalists could never write the truth about war ever again. And that's what they set out to do. Okay, so to get to the 2003 Iraq War, I've talked about the development of cable news, Vietnam syndrome, and I guess now I need to talk about the history of America and the nation of Iraq. All right, Iraq and America. Let's do this. Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire until after the First World War, in which it became a British mandate. Now, this is far outside of the scope of this video, but the mandate system was essentially turning big chunks of what was the Ottoman Empire and sort of the other empires that lost the First World War and turned them into colonies that were then eventually supposed to become independent. And Iraq became under the control of the United Kingdom. And the United States made a point to insist that at some point Iraq should get its own independence. And they did so in January of 1930 when the U.S. recognized Iraq as a sovereign nation. Things were pretty good between the U.S. and Iraq for a while until 1958 when the monarchy of Iraq was overthrown and a republic put in its place. The new leader of Iraq, Abdel Karim Qasim, was very interested in getting Kuwait into its borders, declaring it an indivisible part of the Republic of Iraq. Is going to be a problem down the line. It led to a short-lived Kuwait crisis in 1961, in which things were in a very tight place between Iraq and the then government of President Kennedy. This Kuwait crisis eventually resolved in a coup in 1963, by the Ba'athist Party, which is the party of Saddam Hussein. There's a lot of evidence that the CIA did not directly help in, launching a coup against the government, but a lot of evidence that they knew it was coming and definitely were not interested in stopping it. And much to America's joy, the new president, Abdul Salam Arif, led a bloody massacre of pretty much all suspected communists in the Iraqi government. The Cold War dynamic in Iraq was one of your typical Cold War stories. The U.S. was cautiously optimistic about the Baathists because they were very active in their suppression of left-wing movements, but they were concerned about their treatment in the future of the minority Kurdish population. Kurds being an ethnic group that exists in a whole bunch of countries in the Middle East and in Anatolia. That is another scope for another completely different video, and I just do not have the time to get into right now. The long story short, the U.S. flooded the Iraqi government with money to do its suppressing of left-wing movements, while the Soviets worked in the background to try and undermine the Ba'athist government. This was the state until the Ba'athist government collapsed in November of 1963 due to disagreements over whether or not it should unify with the country of Syria. Arif came back to power after the political collapse, and that led to a period of pretty good relations between Iraq and the United States, including several visits during the reign of President Johnson. That is, up until 1967, in which Arif's government fell after the Six-Day War, which was a war in which several Arab countries tried to invade Israel and failed. And the person who followed that up was a guy by the name of Tahir Yahya, and let's just say America wasn't a fan of his whole let's nationalize the oil industry thing. This collapse led to a bloodless coup in which the Baathists came back into power and remained in power until the fall of the Iraqi government in 2003, i.e. the war that we're about to talk about. This time, the Baathists were not friendly with the United States, and in the Cold War dynamic started to seek closer relations with the Soviet Union and embrace some socialist ideals. The United States responded by trying to prop up its two rivals, Iran to the north and Saudi Arabia to the south. At this point, Iran was run by the Shah, the king/dictator of Iran, who had come in a U.S.-led coup in 1958. I think it was 1958. Tristan, you have to edit in here if it wasn't 1958. But now we have to talk about the complicated relationship between Iran and Iraq. Iraq is a majority Shiite country, but the Ba'athist Party tends to be represented by a part of the Sunni ethnic minority in the country. Iran is a Shiite majority country with a Shiite rulership, and the two countries have always been at heads with each other over this tension. The Shah tried to launch a coup of the Iraqi government in 1970, but failed. And while there are credible allegations that the U.S. tried to help Iran in this effort, there's not enough to say conclusively, and let's just say the State Department's not exactly forthcoming about this. And while Iraq was trying to build a more stable country by allowing for Kurdish autonomy starting in 1970, the United States, which still wanted to get rid of the Ba'athist regime, started to fund and give weapons to Kurdish rebels in 1973. This deal happened to overlap with Richard Nixon's resignation, and Gerald Ford was only given minor details about how it worked, so a lot of this was managed by Henry Kissinger. Dear God, is there any dark part of American foreign policy history that Henry Kissinger doesn't have a part in? This is just another item on the long list of crimes that's going to be read to him as he is descending to hell. Iraq, hey, that rhymes, would come back with some offers of assistance in the wake of the revolution in Iran, where now Iran was an enemy. So Iraq could be a new friend. The U.S. provided Iraq with intelligence and logistical support, but they would help out more once Iraq got involved in the Iraq-Iran war. Iran had a revolution in the 1970s which put in an anti-American government, so all of a sudden the U.S. wanted to be friends with Iraq again. They provided logistical and intelligence support to Iraq, and in the upcoming Iraq-Iran war, provided materials that could be said to be agricultural tools or research things like botulism, anthrax, or the precursor chemicals to make chemical weapons under a guise of plausible deniability. These materials they sold to the Iraqis right up until 1992, by the way. All right, now I'm going to go and call actual Noam Chomsky.
It's worth remembering a little bit of background. Saddam Hussein was indeed an evil dictator. He committed many crimes. He committed those crimes almost entirely with enormous U.S. support. Right through the 1980s, he was carrying out chemical warfare, not only in the war against Iran, but even against Kurds in Iraq. The United States supported him strongly all the way through. Reagan administration tried to pretend that he wasn't responsible for it. Maybe Iran was responsible or some enemy. In fact, the love affair was so extreme that George H.W. Bush, first Bush, when he was president, he actually invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in weapons production. Bush sent a delegation to Iraq headed by Robert Dole, the leading figure in the Republican Party, later presidential candidate, Alan Simpson, others, in order to give his warm regards to his friend Saddam and to tell him to ignore the criticism he was hearing in the press. We can't control the press, so they do terrible things, but we really love you, and so on. It was a real love affair.
The only real tension in their relationship was the uncovering of what was called the Iran-Contra affair, which was essentially an operation under the Reagan government where they were selling weapons during the Iraq-Iran war to Iraq's enemies, the Iranians, i.e., selling weapons to the enemies of their brand new friends, because they wanted to use the proceeds of selling said weapons to buy weapons for the Contras, who were Central American far-right death squads that were killing leftists and union leaders and just groups of indigenous people in general. And that's where America and Iraq were by the end of the 1980s. Now, the Gulf War, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 1991, was soon at hand. Now, what was this about? Well, so remember how I mentioned that Iraq had some historical claims over the country of Kuwait? Well, border friction was starting to increase between the two countries in the late 80s and early 90s, especially over who has the rights to different oil deposits in the borderlands between the two. And Iraq was pretty convinced that the United States, that was now their friend, was not going to intervene if they invaded Kuwait to basically lay claim to their old historical territory as they saw it. Except that the United States did, and that's how we got the Gulf War that we know of today. What's important to know for the Iraq War in 2003 that you have to take away from the Gulf War is that this was a war committed by President George Bush Sr., the President Bush of the early 2000s father, and a lot of the people who surrounded George Bush Sr. were a lot of people who had become seniors in the Bush Jr. administration as well. This led to a decade-long campaign of cutting off trade and putting in, honestly, draconian embargoes on goods going into Iraq, which caused mass starvation and a massive amount of poverty. It's honestly one of the most brutal campaigns of attempted starvation of a country, because starting in 1995, America's official policy on Iraq was essentially that they were to impose regime change. So this is the setup for the Iraq War of 2003. From administration to administration, the clamps were being put down on Iraq as it stuck out as a thorn in American foreign policy in the Middle East, a country that refused to follow America's rules. Their official policy was to use sanctions and starvation essentially to convince the people of Iraq to overthrow their own government. There was no more dealing with Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. It was just regime change. The thing, though, is that America can't just declare war on countries for no reason. America wanted Saddam Hussein gone, but they didn't have anything that they could use to justify an invasion. You know, you need that Casus belli for all you paradox heads. And then 9/11 happened. 9/11 had absolutely nothing to do with Saddam Hussein or Iraq, but it awakened a deep guttural bloodlust in the American people, and they wanted to just see somebody die and pay for what happened. The Bush administration saw that as an opportunity to knock off all the countries on the neocon overthrow this government now checklist, and Iraq was at the top of that. So how do you take an act of terrorism and mass murder that has absolutely nothing to do with Iraq and spin it into a war on a country? Go to the great American pastime. Marketing, baby.
The U.S. government did already have a major commitment to try to invade Iraq and expand its aggression throughout the region. You may recall that General Wesley Clark at the time said that the United States was planning to move into half a dozen countries in the region, assuming that Afghanistan was the first, that Iraq would be the next. They had to have a pretext, obviously, or something to claim.
The U.S. invasion of Iraq leaned on three principles primarily. One, a claim that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, typically trying to lean on the attempt to build a nuclear weapon. Links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, the group that actually did do 9/11. And three, once those two started to show some flaws, focusing more on Saddam Hussein's horrible human rights record and reframe the war as a humanitarian attempt to intervene to help the poor people of Iraq that they just spent a decade trying to starve. So starting pretty soon after 9/11, the United States started to gear up for an invasion of Iraq. This involved building the story that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction.
So the claim was what was called the single question. Will Iraq put an end to its programs of development of weapons of mass destruction?
And that they had all of this very reliable intelligence that backed up that Iraq was planning something. Just you wait and see. They lobbied the United Nations, the Security Council, trying to build the claim that Iraq was building these weapons and that they were concealing the fact that they were building these weapons.
The inspectors, there were inspectors, Scott Ritter, Hans Blix was the head, and others, they said, we can't find anything. Give us more time to investigate. Maybe we'll find something. In fact, there was nothing to find. But the Bush administration didn't want that.
Once the war had already started and the invasion and occupation already underway, that was when all of a sudden the intelligence that led America to believe that the Iraqis were developing weapons of mass destruction turned out to come from extremely unreliable sources. This is going to be a common occurrence, by the way.
After the invasion, which was a brutal, vicious invasion, it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The President, George Bush, the second Bush, thought this was rather amusing. There was even a skit that he presented to the press where he wittily looked under the table, said, "Oh, no weapons here," looked behind the door, "No weapons here." Everyone laughed, thought that was quite funny. After having devastated the country, killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed it, and so on.
There was some investigations, more deep and thorough investigations that happened after the war's main phase during the American occupation, basically. But all they really came up with was some decayed precursor materials for chemical weapons. You know, the kinds of things that the U.S. had been selling to Iraq since the late 80s. And some politicians like Rick Santorum took this as the smoking gun that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, but this was a laughable claim, and everybody could tell that this was them reaching for anything. These precursors not only were not weapons of mass destruction and were certainly a far cry from the yellow cake uranium refinement that they were claiming that Iraq was undergoing, but they were trying to make the case that these were still dangerous. The problem, though, is that they were also well past their expiry date and probably could not have been turned into anything deadly even if they tried. In fact, the evidence that led to them discovering these precursors came from an IED that was filled with sarin gas. The problem, though, is that this deadly gas was so expired and such low quality that it didn't really do anything anyway.
It wanted to find a reason to go to war. It also added some other claims. It said there are connections between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, which is extremely unlikely if you look at the nature of the two institutions. And Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney tried hard, in fact, even resorted to torture to try to find connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam, which would justify, or at least give a pretext for the invasion.
Because they wanted to put Iraq under the umbrella of America's general bloodlust in this area. I just want to point out how silly this is on its face. The Baathists and Saddam Hussein's government in general was pretty secular. It's actually one of the more secular countries in the Middle East at the time. And Al-Qaeda were a group of radical religious fundamentalists. They could not have more disagreements about pretty much everything. And if the Iraq War had been successful, it probably would have led to subsequent invasions of other countries on the neocon war wish list. This was an implied axis of evil, which were countries that maybe were doing stuff with each other or were sponsors of terrorism, but it involved countries that had diametrically opposite views that hated each other, like Iraq and Iran, but also had countries that had nothing to do with terrorism and nothing to do with anything going on really in the Middle East, like North Korea. Here's a quote from Robert Mueller. Yes, that Robert Mueller, the one that liberals were gushing about a few years ago, trying to make the sale for this axis of evil.
February 11th, 2003, FBI Director Robert Mueller testified to Congress that, quote, 7 countries designated as state sponsors of terrorism, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, and North Korea, remain active in the U.S. and continue to support terrorist groups that have targeted Americans.
And again, miraculously, after the war had already begun, these links turned out to be pretty bogus. In fact, worse than bad intelligence, these links were essentially squeezed out of somebody under torture. The argument was that there was some connection between Hussein and a person by the name of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian terrorist who might have had connections to Osama bin Laden. But this was quickly discredited by many organizations. Despite this fact being well known, Dick Cheney, the vice president to George Bush, still insisted that there was a connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda, which actually alienated him from the intelligence community and drew a lot of criticism from top-ranking Democrats. But let's not forget that a lot of top-ranking Democrats, including probably a lot of people who are running for president in 2024, voted in favor of the war. The war launched under extremely shaky grounds. And to make matters worse, the State Department did list a list of countries, about 45 of them, that al-Qaeda was operating in, and none of them were Iraq until after the invasion. Yeah, we don't talk about this much, but after Iraq was invaded by the United States, al-Qaeda started to arrive and was bolstered in recruits to fight the United States. One of the leaders of al-Qaeda in Iraq would go to rename himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and would be the founder of ISIS. Pretty soon afterwards, this developed into overall criticism of the Bush administration, essentially showing that they fabricated links in order to force a war of aggression to happen. So it pretty much is true that the United States went into an illegal war of aggression, something that is a war crime. Yet, despite that, George W. Bush walks free today. He's not in a prison. He's never been tried. He's never been in The Hague. The ICC hasn't put a warrant out for his arrest. He might have done one of the most disastrous and most bloody events in the 21st century. I know I get mad about this stuff. So with the al-Qaeda connection dead and the weapons of mass destruction being a big nothing burger, they defaulted back to pointing out Saddam Hussein's terrible human rights record.
Well, at that point, they had to find another reason. So Bush came out with a speech in which he said the real reason for our invasion of Iraq was a promotion of democracy.
And I won't mince words. Saddam Hussein, in his 20-plus years running Iraq, killed and tortured thousands of his own citizens. In the mid-1980s, he used gas attacks on Kurdish resistance fighters and killed thousands of people in the region. After the Gulf War, he further killed a ton of Shiite and Kurdish rebels. And another ethnic group in southern Iraq called the Marsh Arabs were also brutally treated and displaced from the region. Saddam Hussein was a brutal and terrible dictator. There is no doubt of that. But you know who is a more terrible and more brutal dictator than Saddam Hussein? The royal family of Saudi Arabia, a country that the United States still claims as a close and dear ally to this day. So there's a lot of picking your friends and being rather discriminatory in when you fight these dear, heroic wars to help poor, beleaguered human rights violations around the world, as long as they're on the wish list of countries America doesn't want around anymore.
All the discussion was about our noble endeavor to bring democracy to Iraq. There was actually a Gallup poll in Iraq at the time, which asked people what they thought about it. Some agreed. 1% of Iraqis said yes, it's invaded to bring democracy. 5% said.
All know this video took me like 3 days to film, and I know that you guys will notice the very drastic difference at this point. I got a statue from one of my friends, and I put it on the shelf, but it wasn't there. It wasn't there on Friday when I filmed live. Anyways, we need to discuss what was one of the key factors that the United States did in order to prevent another Vietnam syndrome situation happening. They needed to find a way to make journalists feel like they weren't being censored or controlled, but still toe more or less the line of what America's government wanted the press to see. And that was very successful in the form of using embedded journalists. So during the 1991 Gulf War, the press complained that the U.S. really didn't give journalists a whole lot of access and information about what was going on. In response to that, the United States said, okay, well, if you want information about what we're doing, you can have journalists join us in the war. That means that, like, actual journalists, people who would be reporting for major news organizations, would be embedded within military units fighting, well, not fighting, but reporting alongside as the fighting is happening. It sounds really good, right? Like, what better access to a war is there than being right there, right alongside the soldiers fighting the war on the front lines? And it seemed that the press really liked it because there were as many as 775 embedded journalists in Iraq as part of the war. The thing about the United States, though, is that this was not an effort to open up and give more information to a free press. The Pentagon saw embedded journalists as a way to win the information war and stop Vietnam syndrome. Because here's how it worked. The United States got to choose who became embedded journalists, which meant that they could, say, not accept the applications of journalists that they knew might report unfavorably about the war or about the actions of troops. Not to mention there's a psychological effect. If you are a journalist and you are reporting alongside the same soldiers every day, and when they're in danger, you're in danger, your perspective is going to get warped. You're going to see the entire conflict through the eyes of, in this case, the aggressors in the war, the invaders, the conquerors. And that's even more troublesome when you realize that that's really the only way that the American people got to see the war. There's a really great New York Times article by Private Chelsea Manning that goes into great detail. I'll just give you a few quotes.
Manning charged that vetting of reporters by military public affairs officials was used to screen out those judged likely to produce critical coverage. A result, wrote Manning, is that the American public's access to the facts is gutted, which leaves them with no way to evaluate the conduct of American officials.
As part of joining the embedded journalists, they had to sign a contract that would say that they weren't allowed to give any information that might be a danger to security. So, you can understand the basics of this. Like, if you are working alongside actual soldiers at the front lines of a war as a journalist, it would not be great if you were to, say, report on what their maneuvers are or what position they're in or anything like that, right? The problem, though, is that the government used that to seriously curtail what reporters were allowed to report on, to the point where a lot of journalists, even those who were in the field, started to complain. All of this resulted in a lot of mainstream journalists taking information from the ground, essentially molding themselves into a communications arm for the Pentagon, cheerleading the war and not criticizing either the causes of the war in particular or the conduct of soldiers on the ground.
Those correspondents who drive around in tanks and armored personnel carriers, said journalist Gay Talese in an interview, who are spoon-fed what the military gives them, and they become mascots for the military. These journalists. I wouldn't have journalists embedded if I had any power. There are stories you can do that aren't done. I've said that many times.
We were a propaganda arm of our governments. At the start, the censors enforced that, but by the end, we were our own censors. We were cheerleaders.
And this does seem to bear out in more deep analyses of media and the Iraq War. The Center for Public Inquiry found that the Bush administration lied over 930 times about information regarding to the Iraq War, and did not get pressed back against them by the mainstream press. And the large 24-hour networks got exactly what they wanted. It was the most widely covered invasion in history. 24-hour news networks got a huge boost in popularity because of the horrific, mind-burning images of 9/11 happening just a couple years earlier. And the escalating war on terror meant that a lot more people felt obligated to watch the news. Not to mention, these networks tend to crib off each other. The most popular 24-hour cable news network at the time of the Iraq invasion was Fox News. I think it still is the most popular today. Fox is owned by a man named Rupert Murdoch, who is a powerful media mogul and arch neocon who is a huge proponent of just wars in general, but was a particularly big fan of the Iraq War. This resulted in a media environment on these networks that the organization Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting demonstrated overwhelming support for the war on all of the major cable news networks, but especially Fox and CBS. But they weren't alone. One of the good 24-hour news networks, from a lot of people's perspective, the more liberal-leaning MSNBC, also was a huge cheerleader for the war. They published sections called America's Bravest and fired liberal commentators who dared criticize the reasoning for going into Iraq. MSNBC, shortly before the war, fired Phil Donahue, who was a critic of the Iraq War, and replaced him with Dan Savage, a conservative commentator. And not just like a straight-up business decision, Savage's show did way worse than Donahue's. And he wasn't alone. There were several cases of journalists getting fired for either reporting on the war in ways that the government didn't approve of, or in ways that were violations of their secrecy clauses, including Geraldo Rivera, who apparently got kicked out of his embedded journalism situation because he just reported straight up on where some soldiers were, which you could imagine a war is not exactly a good idea. And what you would think is the number one job of journalists, to inform, didn't seem to really do the trick. One study of public opinion found that regular news viewers, to the tune of 57%, believed that Iraq was working with al-Qaeda or had given support to al-Qaeda in some fashion. And 69%, of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein had something specific and direct to do with the September 11th attacks. 22% of Americans believed that weapons of mass destruction had been found in Iraq, a patently false statement, and this percentage varies based on which network they were following, with, not surprisingly, the most misinformed being the regular viewers of Fox News. For example, a lot of the reporting into the 2003 UN report from Colin Powell showed that
Colin Powell gave a by now notorious address at the United Nations in which he presented what he claimed was definitive evidence that Iraq was involved and was developing weapons of mass destruction, was a great threat to the world. We just had to do something to save the world and save Iraqis from his devastating. The press just repeated the claims made by the government as if we have to take them seriously. It performed its usual duty of relaying to the public the claims of state and private power. There was almost total opposition in the world to the war. It was overwhelming. Even close allies, except for Britain, refused to participate. That was all basically dismissed.
The same FAIR report found that 64% of guests on media programs showed a pro-war position, and that many anti-war leaders and experts and voices were actively displaced or put in a situation where they weren't given a chance to speak. Or if there were anti-Iraq war voices, they would only ever show up if there was a pro-Iraq war voice on the air in order to counter them out, which was not the same for people who were pro-war. Overall, if you were to tune in during the first months of the Iraq war at any given time, you were 6 times more likely to be seeing somebody talking favorably of the war. If you are just limiting it to guests from the United States, it was almost 25 times more likely. And in the longer stretches of time, we've seen that the media did a lot of work to underreport the amount of Iraqi civilian casualties in the war, which goes well north of 6 digits, and some reports even go as high as 600,000. And there were often a reframing of events to make the American invasion seem more popular than it was. One of the most famous being the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue, which was a planned media event with the help of the U.S. military, but was framed as a sort of spontaneous people's revolution against the Hussein government. As the security situation in Iraq got worse and it became more and more dangerous for journalists to report there, they began to rely more on official statements from the military and less on on-the-ground reporting, making their position even more sanitized by the Pentagon. And what this all resulted in is essentially a media that did not take the government to task on the legality of an illegal war of aggression.
See if you can find one statement in 20 years in the mainstream that says it was a war crime. It was the kind of crime for which Nazis were hanged at Nuremberg, pure aggression of gross violation of the UN Charter.
The majority of Americans polled at the time of the invasion believed that the U.S. should only invade Iraq if they have permission from the United Nations to do so, because of all the inspections and weapons and stuff like that. The U.S. didn't do that, and the media didn't do its job to inform people of what was going on. And the Pentagon can't be a good source. They are an active and interested party in the war. Obviously, there's a lot of signs. They do a lot of sketchy things. I mean, if you know anything about American history, you should know that. But even a report that came out in 2016 showed that the Pentagon was paying a British firm to literally make a fake terrorist videos in a way to further the PR of the war effort. The New York Times eventually did apologize for not being more dogged in its pursuit of the truth when it came to the legality of the war in Iraq, which I guess is nice, but I would have preferred if a lot of mainstream news institutions actually did their due diligence when the state is going to war. These moments, these critical periods where the fate of entire nations are on the line, that's when journalists need to be doing their job the most. America can't consider itself even close to a democracy if there isn't an informed press that is telling people about what needs to be thought of in order to make their decisions about the public service. And furthermore, the American press focused on these positive events like this toppling statue and didn't focus on some of the worst atrocities committed in the war by U.S. troops. For example, look at the twisted way that we remember the Battle of Fallujah.
U.S. Navy just commissioned its latest vessel, amphibious assault vessel. It's called the USS Fallujah. Fallujah was one of the most atrocious crimes of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Well, the world doesn't find this amusing. So you can read in the international, in the Al Jazeera, for example, you can read bitter condemnations of this. In fact, Iraqis don't find it amusing. Iraqi journalists bitterly condemning this, saying the United States not only devastated and destroyed our country, committed horrifying atrocities in Fallujah, but now 20 years later, the U.S. is killing us again by killing the memory of what they did. Try to find a reference to this in the U.S. media. This is a shocking incident. To name a naval vessel after one of the worst atrocities of the invasion passes in silence. Tells you what the media are. It's not that they don't know about it. Of course, you can read the official Navy statement. Well, actually, to the credit of the media, if you look back 20 years when the attack on Fallujah took place, they did describe it accurately as a hideous war crime, all forgotten.
By getting very educational in this video, but I'm hoping that you guys are along for the ride with me anyway. So we're going to talk now about why we see what happened. The media didn't do its job in covering an important moment in 21st century history. They didn't hold the government to account. What factors did the state do beforehand that are exemplary of the nature of the way that media functions that led to this strange situation? Well, first, I want to talk about manufacturing consent. I'm sure there are many of you who are waiting for me to talk about manufacturing consent. And yes, it's an extremely important book for understanding why the news chooses to cover things the way they do. Manufacturing Consent, written by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, is a book about the propaganda model, which is an analysis of the role of the media, the news media specifically, in holding up the elite capitalist hierarchy. Basically, its role in the political and economic structure of the world we live in. Essentially, what their conclusion is that there are 5 major factors that allows them to curate what becomes newsworthy and what gets in front of people's faces and their attention. And they use these tools to essentially massage the narrative about what's going on in the world in order to serve everything that capitalism serves: rich people. So first of all, to understand the media's position in the Iraq War, you also have to know that there was a lot of media consolidation in the years leading up to the Iraq War. So there weren't as many institutions that really needed to massage, and it means that there weren't that many that could go rogue. Basically, between 1980 and during like Reagan's deregulation of a lot of the laws regarding corporate mergers, a lot of the media companies turn themselves into just a handful of massive media conglomerates. That's how you end up with corporations with names like AOL, Time Warner, Discovery, HBO Max, Disney, Lockheed Martin, or whatever. The other thing that's important to factor for understanding the way that news media works is that their primary business is not doing journalism. I've talked about this on my channel in the past, but you need to understand that if you are to understand different organizations under capitalism, if they are private entities, they are not a machine for producing the thing that you want them to produce. They are a machine for producing profit. Since I got the Pathfinder book over there, I think I'm going to use that as an example. Hasbro, the makers of Dungeons & Dragons, are not in the business of making Dungeons & Dragons. They're not in the business of making games. They're in the business of making money. The people who run the company are majority stockholders, and their interest is in maintaining growth in quarterly profits by staking out a niche in a certain industry, and in their case, the gaming industry. News media is in the advertising industry, kind of like me, actually. This means that the bottom line, the main function of a lot of mainstream news, is to produce profit. And they do so by carving out their niche, which is the need for companies to market their products and services to you guys. Just realized it'd be really funny if there was like a mid-roll ad right when I said that. Yay, capitalism. But because their fates are so tied to selling advertisements, that means that they need two things to function. One, they need attention because the media's main purpose is to create attention so that they can focus that attention on advertisements. And two, they need to keep advertisers happy. They don't want anything to show up on the program that might make an advertiser think that they don't want to be associated with that brand. This is the logic behind the adpocalypse that happened on YouTube a number of years back, where multiple brands threatened to pull their advertisements off of YouTube because they saw their brand associated with content, and in this case it was ISIS recruitment videos, that they didn't want to see. And YouTube had to develop an entire system of taking creators' money away from them in order to make, Pepsi happy. So then look at the Iraq War. To take a stance against the Iraq War in the months leading up to the invasion was highly controversial, one that could make advertisers angry. So there was a material interest, i.e. an interest to their budgets, their bottom line, their corporate dividends, to not cover criticism of the war, or at least not cover it in a way that, Pepsi could look at, I don't know why I'm on Pepsi's case today, but that Pepsi could not look at CNN and see, the war is bad, the Bush administration is committing a war crime, and now a message from Pepsi. They didn't want that association with their brand because there were lots of people who were like swearing off of products if they were even having a whiff of being associated with criticizing the war. If you want a case, you can look at what the Dixie Chicks experienced when they had semi-criticism of the George Bush administration and the Iraq war in general. So we've got 2 of the 5 filters covered now. Ownership. The fact that there was a small number of very powerful media corporations that controlled the majority of what your average American saw as news. 2, advertising. You had a strong material interest in keeping advertisers happy and keeping attention on your product, which means that you would filter your content to ensure that there's as much attention on your stuff as possible and that you're not making advertisers angry. The next filter is sourcing. You can shape a lot of a narrative by whose voices you listen to as sources. And as I mentioned earlier, they listened a lot to official sources. They took the military's official releases as gospel. They covered the events that the military put forward, like Colin Powell's address to the UN, and just took it as granted, and in many ways marginalized sources and voices that were against the war. By picking and choosing who they listened to, they could craft a narrative in and of itself. That's 3. 4 is flack. Essentially, there was also a system of criticism and attacks on dissenting voices. And there was a lot of language going on that really put a lot of criticism against anybody who had issues with the war. There was terms like, if you're not with us, you're against us. When Jacques Chirac, the president of France at the time, refused to send French troops to Iraq, the United States responded by petty things like renaming French fries to freedom fries and stuff like that. But because of the effort to discredit and marginalize anti-war voices like Hans Blix, for example, the UN weapons inspector, there was a pressure put on the journalists who were working on the ground to not publish anything negative lest they be at the receiving end of said criticism themselves. You could see that for their career interests, keeping a job, A lot of anti-war journalists just straight up lost their jobs during the Iraq War. In order to keep yourself employed and respected in your industry, there was a lot of pressure to conform to the dominant narrative, to not push back against your bosses, your superiors, people who had more experience than you, established institutions, possibly even losing access to sources. And all of that is pressure on journalists to not push against the war. And the fifth filter, which, given that the book came out in 1988, is a reference to anti-communism, which, factored into, media in the 1980s. But in a more modern edition of the book, they refer to it as anti-terrorism ideology. And that is that there's a strong anti-terrorism message out there. I mean, I'm generally not a fan of terrorism myself, but the messaging and laser focus on anti-terrorism that we kind of forget about how intense that was in the years following 9/11, but that was also a form of pressure. There was an intentional program by the US government to try and link Saddam Hussein and Iraq to the acts of Al-Qaeda and the terrorists who did the September 11th attacks. It wasn't real, but there was a thing there that you could say that if you oppose the Iraq war, then they could claim that you were then in support of the terrorists. Not to mention, if they say that this is the fight against terrorism, and the whole media project before this has been to get attention and sell ads, drum up more and more fear about the threat of terrorists, then you see even more forces in play pushing people towards supporting the war. Any good historian knows that a source, even one that you vehemently disagree with, can still contain useful information, sometimes even more so. But to get a complete picture, you need to read widely. Reading widely is critical for sorting through different biases and editorial positions. You can see not just what happened, but different degrees of emphasis. You'll see who gets included, and importantly, who gets left out. You'll gain a more complete picture of the event, but you'll also learn the dominant narratives being generated about it. But that sounds really, really tough, doesn't it? But luckily I have something to help you with that, and that's today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers all the world's media in one place so you can swipe between articles to discover which details are emphasized, exaggerated, or left out entirely. It's a good launching pad for your reading journey into a subject. You can compare coverage on a story at a glance, or learn for yourself how different institutions are framing any given subject. And as Chomsky pointed out in my interview, a lot of great stories get buried in America, and an international approach can really help. There's a map feature which lets you see how different regions cover a story. Ground News won't do the work of telling you what's true, but it will give you the tools to read widely, consider where your blind spots might be, and understand the larger narrative yourself. The Iraq War was a prime example of how the media can push a certain narrative to the public. By using Ground News, you can read different sources and get a more complete picture of what's really happening. Go to ground.news/stepback to try Ground News for free, or subscribe to get access to all the features you see here and support a small team of independent media outsiders working to make the news more accountable. All right, now let's get back to the content. The second aspect we have to look at is the concept of a virtuous war, which was an attempt to reframe warfare as something that is good and sanitary in a post-Cold War context. It's a theory put forth by an author named James Jerdarian that essentially talks about how modern warfare is driven by a few major themes, specifically a belief in technology, virtuality, which I'll talk about in a second, and morality, which together builds a concept of war that is virtuous and not only good, but necessary. So I'll break down these three pillars real quick. The faith in technology is the idea that war can be made less dangerous and less terrible, especially to your own troops, but with less collateral damage through faith in technology, especially things like targeted ballistic missiles and drone warfare. All of these will allow for what the neoliberal dream of a war that is bloodless. And the media played its role as well, showing emphasis on the cutting-edge new weapons technology and how it was going to make it so that there were less victims of collateral damage, that these missiles always went to exactly where they went, or just random things like Brian Williams talking about the majesty of our weapons.
From the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the eastern Mediterranean, I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons."
Or whatever. I literally always just pause in absolute dumbfounded shock whenever I think about that line. The second pillar is virtuality. Virtuality is the work to create a distance, to almost abstract the war into something that's more of a concept than a violent struggle in which people are dying in horrific ways. By downplaying civilian casualties and drawing attention to the spectacle of the shock and awe of the war, as well as mediating the impact of the war through sanitized depictions on TV, the media played a role in helping make the war seem more appetizing through making it look more like film, like spectacle. Just realizing that I probably should have added simulation and simulacra in this, but this video is already a little chunky. And the last is morality. So the last pillar of the way that the U.S. state has tried to encourage more war is through framing each war as some sort of moral cause. After the disastrous failure of their claims of linking Iraq to terrorism, or trying to say that Saddam Hussein is developing weapons of mass destruction, they leaned back on the abysmal human rights record of the Hussein regime, which, again, I'm not denying, but it was all in the service of legitimizing and sanitizing a war of aggression. So the role of the media in the Iraq War when looking at the virtuous war theory is that without proper criticism, all the media really acted as is as a conduit for what the military's desires were. And their desires were to legitimize, sanitize, and distance the people of the United States from the war they were committing in order to achieve their geopolitical prerogatives, i.e. invading a country with no probable cause, and yet not deal with the overwhelming backlash at home that one might get from such an illegal war, a la Vietnam syndrome. And further proving Noam and Chomsky's point, you see that there's a deep interconnected pattern between the military, the arms manufacturing industry, and media. It's called the military-industrial media complex, which I'm sure many of you have heard about the military-industrial complex, about how the military puts a lot of money into the hands of arms manufacturers, so arms manufacturers make a lot of money, and then they are incentivized to push the U.S. government to get into more military engagements so that they can buy more weapons, and the people who come from the arms manufacturing industry go into the military, and people from the military go into it, and it's all sort of connected. Well, further research has shown that the media is also part of this because war is also good for media business. When America is blowing up a country, Americans tune into the news, and that sells advertising. The term military-industrial complex has its dates back to 1961 in the farewell address of President Ike Eisenhower, where he warned that this process was starting to build under his administration and that it needs to be countered in the future. And as we talked about when we were talking about manufacturing consent, when the U.S. military wanted an invasion of Iraq, probably influenced by the fact that Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all of them wanted to sell some knife missiles, the media, which also would want to get a big ratings boost from a war, would also play along with advancing the interests of the war in order to get big advertising dollars, because ad rates, the CPMs in the internet terms, but advertising rates during wars are way higher because they anticipate a lot more people are going to be watching. Another big economic incentivization to not criticize the government in such a time, because then you might get yourself in trouble and then gonna get the views. And because of, even if unspoken, collaboration nonetheless, the media, the military, and the arms manufacturing industry all got the things they wanted. They got their war. Even if they had to sell overt lies to the American people to do so. And I think it's not so far out of place to say that a lot of our mistrust in the government and in media institutions might have something to do with this. Because what's really important to point out is that journalism has an important role to play in a democracy. Their job is to inform the public and hold those in power to account. And no matter how hard that job is, whether there's advertising incentives or loss of connections or sources, that's your duty. And to not do that is a dereliction of the very point of their being journalists. In many ways, access and commercial journalism has blunted what journalists are even able to do. But I do want to point out that there are a lot of very good journalists in the trenches doing the work every day. I know I came off as pretty harsh against the entire discipline at this point, but I have to mention that this is the economic system that journalism exists within. This isn't a condemnation of every individual journalist. There are lots of people writing articles in mainstream news institutions that are important things that need to be said and need to be written about. They just don't get a lot of attention. The powers of political economy are strong, and the field has even been further delegitimized by a concerted right-wing effort to undermine truthful journalism. So yeah, journalism is important and it's good, and there are journalists who are doing very good work, essential work. They're informing the public on things that they need to know about, even working in mainstream news institutions. It's just that, capitalism is bad.
When you look at the actual reporting, what reporters are reporting on the ground, it's very valuable. Honest, courageous, they do a good job. You mentioned my book with Ed Herman, Manufacturing Consent. A lot of people have read maybe the first chapter, but not many people have read the book. If you read the book, you find that about a third of the book is defending the media from attacks by right-wing organizations, Freedom House in particular, who are attacking the media for losing the Vietnam War by their critical commentary. Well, I went through all that, showed that their attacks were total lies, total fabrication. The journalists on the ground were doing an honest, serious job, but within a framework. Jingoist propaganda framework is we're making a mistake, we're doing things that are not in line with our values and our commitments. Happens not to be true, but the reporting itself was accurate, often courageous, and very important.
But what do we do about it? How do we keep ourselves informed? Well, in the meantime, until we can overthrow the bourgeoisie and end this capitalist cycle of misery and growth for the sake of growth that's putting us in a worse and worse place all the time and leading to the constant environmental degradation that's going to eventually destroy the very life systems that keep the planet going. Until that cycle of pain and misery is over, I asked this question of Noam Chomsky, and he gave a pretty good answer.
Well, I should say the first thing I do in the morning is read the national press, New York Times, Washington Post, Business Press. It's the best way to find out in general what's going on in the world. Then you have to read it with a very critical mind. You have to understand the way what reaches us is shaped, framed, manipulated, and then look for other sources. They exist. I mean, what I've just cited is all perfectly easily available. Takes one click on the internet to read Al Jazeera if you want, or other foreign press, or independent sources in the United States. There are lots of things you can find on postings on the internet, the kinds of things you're doing, for example. They're all up on the internet. Okay, you can find them easily enough. I have myself dozens of articles constantly on these things appearing in Truth Out, other places. Common Dreams has lots of stuff. You can find things all over the Sheer Post. Plenty of material. Plus the international media. It's very interesting to check this. So take Ukraine again. There was a lot of excitement in the United States, in the media, a couple of months ago, about how India was breaking with Russia, finally. It was going to condemn the war in Ukraine and join the United States in its activities there. This was based on 6 words that were said by the Indian Prime Minister Modi, at a meeting that he had with President Putin in Samarkand. Modi said, "War is not the answer. We should look for peace," what everyone in the South says. Those words were taken all over the media to show that India is breaking with Russia. It takes 2 seconds on the internet to look up the Indian government website. And of course, you find Modi's speech there. Yes, he said, war is not the answer. And then he went on, which was virtually a love letter to Putin, saying our relations are stronger than they've ever been. We'll work together for our common interest in peace and so on. All of that was cut out. Well, you ask what young people can do when you read that statement in the press. First thing you do is look at the Indian government website to see what was actually said. Takes a minute, not a lot of work. And then you find out. And the same is true on issue after issue. Takes a little work, not very much.
Furthermore, it's important to support independent critical journalists. You know, some of your friends who might have a Substack, maybe toss them a few bucks. Actually, I have a friend who has a Substack. Maybe I should toss him a few bucks. And just in the same way that we hold government institutions to account, we should probably hold media institutions to account. It's sort of one of those things where the stakes are too high for them to really be a private entity, but also a lot of their mission gets quite underwritten if they are just like an arm of the government. There are a lot of countries that have these publicly funded but still independent news organizations, but even they have their own version of manufacturing consent because they know where their budgets come from, you know what I mean? So again, having something that's more independently funded by people who believe in the project would be great. Or at the very least, we should make demands that journalists talk about how they are making these sort of editorial decisions in a more public way. And furthermore, we all need to individually become more educated. We need to know when we are being manipulated. We need to know that there are interests at play in our mainstream news culture. And if we are ignorant of that, we are going to be led into war after war after war as the military-industrial media complex keeps feeding in order to increase their bottom lines. We just need to be aware of this, and we need to be critical, especially when it seems that the government and the media are trying to drum us up for another war. Well, I guess I just ended on giving you guys homework. If you want, the full Noam Chomsky interview is available on Nebula. Enjoy that, subscribe, like, etc., and I'll see you guys next time.